You ever hear something so small, 5 words, that it rearranges your whole life? That's what happened to me that Sunday. We were supposed to be celebrating. Roast chicken on the table, my grandson chasing the dog, my son laughing with a beer in hand. Instead, Claire turned, wiped her hands on a towel and said, "You're not family." The words landed like a closed door. For a moment, I stared. I kept the dish in my hands because dropping it felt like admitting defeat. My son looked down at his phone, the kind of silence that's louder than any argument. I left without spectacle, no shouting, just the long drive home where every red light gave me time to practice how not to cry. It's funny how the smallest cruelty makes the world very large and very lonely. That night, I paced my kitchen, the house suddenly too quiet. I scrolled social media and saw pictures of them smiling at last week's barbecue where I wasn't invited. I drafted polite messages and deleted them. Then, like a match struck in the dark, an idea lit. If she would make me invisible in her house, I could remind the world who I was. I could speak, and maybe someone would listen where she would not. The next afternoon, I sat with my phone on the counter and went live. My voice shook in the first 30 seconds, but I forced it steady. "Hello," I said, calm like I'd practiced in the mirror. "Tonight, I want to talk about family, what it means when someone tells you you're not family." The live started with 10 people, then 20, then 50. For every story I told about casseroles and school plays, someone typed "Me too" in the comments. There's a loop in every story worth telling. It starts with a question and only closes when you reveal the answer. My question was simple. Who gets to decide if you belong? I kept the loop open by not naming names. I spoke about the hurt of being pushed to the periphery and the quiet dignity of showing up anyway. The more I spoke, the more messages flowed in. Strangers, neighbors, old friends, people who'd felt the same sting of rejection. By the time I ended the live, my throat was sore, but my heart felt raw and awake. More importantly, the screen that once showed strangers now showed faces with names and comments that reached into my living room like warm hands. Some offered meals, others told their stories. My phone buzzed through the night with people saying, "We're with you." At that moment, I realized the world was bigger than Claire's kitchen. I had opened a door and people were walking through it.
When the live ended, I expected silence. Instead, my phone buzzed like a beehive. Messages poured in. "You're my neighbor. My mum was treated that way. You made me cry." The most surprising thing was a private message from a woman who said she'd driven across town that night just to bring a pie. Another message was from an old church friend who offered to come and sit with me the next Sunday. Little sparks of kindness were appearing where I had expected only cold shoulders. Word travels fast when something feels true. Within 24 hours, strangers were tagging their friends and my live had been shared beyond the town. The next day, a neighbor I barely knew knocked at my door with a casserole and an embarrassed smile. "I saw your video," she said. "I wanted to bring something." My living room began to collect faces at the edges. People who'd been there when I taught Sunday school, the woman from the PTA who remembered the time I'd made cupcakes for a bake sale. They came because the story resonated. Not because they knew the politics of my marriage, but because family is a universal ache. When Claire saw the video, her reaction was complicated. At first she was furious. She texted my son, called her sister. Then the messages came to her too. Friends, colleagues, and even co-workers who watched my live and thought, who treats someone like that? It didn't excuse her words, but it nudged a crack into the wall she'd built around herself. She called the house and asked if she could stop by. I agreed. It felt like a test I hadn't studied for. The day she came, she sat on my couch as if she were a guest in a movie about my life. Her eyes were red and she fumbled with a mug as if it were a talisman. "I saw your video," she said. "I'm sorry." Apologies are funny things. They are balms and shards all at once. I didn't bask, I listened. She explained pressures I'd been blind to: new job stress, parenting expectations, constant comparison with others' curated lives. She admitted she'd said something horrible in a moment of power when she felt cornered by life. But confession isn't always restitution. My son, who had stayed quiet that Sunday, came later that week. He hugged me and said, "Mum, I messed up." I forgave him out loud, but forgiveness is a practice, not an event. The loop I started with the live had begun to close a little, not with a theatrical reconciliation, but with quiet conversations and small acts. People from the live offered to host meals and invited us to community events. The ball of support rolled through the neighborhood, and with each push, it gained momentum. If this story reminds you of someone, a parent or an in-law who was pushed aside, send them a message today. Sometimes a small note can be the opening of a whole new conversation.
3 days after the live, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my apron, expecting a casserole or one more neighbor. Instead, I opened the door to 50 faces on my lawn. Neighbors with candles and casseroles. People who had only known me from social media, but felt they knew me as kin. My daughter-in-law stood awkwardly at my son's side, phone in hand like a shield. She had called my son, asking him to bring people over, but none of them had planned the candlelight vigil. It had just happened. I felt like I was standing in a snow globe of my own life. My grandson ran between legs, delighted by the lights and warm voices. Tables were set under string lights. A local friend had turned up with a microphone and a stack of folding chairs. "We wanted to show you that family can be chosen," she said, voice quivering. I hadn't expected such a scene, and to be honest, I didn't know how to behave. Do you cry? Do you cook? Do you laugh like nothing happened? The real surprise came when strangers began to stand and tell their stories. A woman near the front spoke about being written out of a wedding by her own sister. A man told a story about his father who hadn't spoken at the funeral. Each confession landed soft and heavy, and each one nudged my own hurt into a shared place where it lost its sharpest edges. My daughter-in-law listened. She cried. My son leaned on me and said quietly, "I had no idea it went so deep." I remember a moment when she came up to me, hand extended, and hesitated. "I didn't mean what I said," she whispered. I took her hand, feeling the awkwardness and pain of a grown woman who'd wielded hurt like a weapon. "Words matter, but people can learn," I said. The crowd clapped like they would at the end of a show, but this applause felt different. It was a collective witness to repair. That night, we ate together in the yard. There were awkward conversations and genuine ones. My grandson fell asleep on a blanket, and for the first time in days, I felt some peace. The loop that began with a phone call and a harsh sentence had widened into a circle of people who carried us that evening. I thought of my live, which had started as a private place to cry, and now had become the birthplace of a neighborhood's public kindness. If you've ever been moved by a stranger's kindness, share this story. Sometimes the world needs reminding that hearts can hold room for more than anger. After the gathering, life didn't snap back. There were conversations that felt like mending seams, slow, careful stitches that might hold if tended. Claire and I started a ritual of weekly coffee. No big topics, just small things to relearn one another. At first, we spoke in cautious sentences, like two people learning to walk on glass. Then, slowly, the rhythm came. A shared joke, a story about my son's terrible haircut in high school, the memory of a casserole burned to charcoal and still eaten with laughter. Those tiny moments were the mortar. My son sought counseling, which surprised me and warmed me at the same time. He wanted to be a better husband and father, not because someone shamed him, but because he genuinely didn't like the person he'd become under the pressure of silence. Watching him take steps to be present, dropping by more often, playing with his boy in the yard instead of scrolling through his phone, was healing for me and for him. The loop tightened into a braided rope of accountability. But healing is messy. There were days Claire snapped back into old habits, curt words that echoed the Sunday comment, We had difficult talks, sometimes tears, sometimes slammed doors. Each time she stumbled, I remembered that the live had started with my voice shaking. Not perfect, just human. I held the line of empathy, not to excuse, but to stabilize. We began to invite neighbors over for low-pressure evenings, board games, potluck dinners, the kind of unremarkable bonding that does a lot of quiet work. My grandson became the glue in ways I hadn't predicted. He offered earnest apologies when he saw us sad. He drew pictures and insisted we hang them on the kitchen wall. He introduced a game where we all had to say one nice thing about the person on our left. Laughter became a practice more than a pastime. The community of strangers who had shown up turned into friendlier faces in the supermarket, a wave at the bus stop, small constancies that stitch you back into life. If you're following along and want more stories like this, stories where everyday people choose courage over silence, subscribe to Celeb Pulse. Real life is messy, but it's worth telling. A month later, I posted a simple picture from that night. String lights, plates, my daughter-in-law handing me a slice of pie. The caption read, "Family isn't a label, it's who shows up." It was a quiet post, but people reacted as if it were a small miracle. Messages flowed. "Thank you for showing me how to stand. My mom and I made up after we watched this. My in-laws invited me over tonight." The miracle wasn't the clicks, it was the ripples. Claire and I kept our ritual. We had hard conversations about boundaries and respect. She apologized again, publicly and privately, and I accepted her apology because I saw genuine change. My son came to family dinners without excuses. The house smelled of roast chicken again, but now the laughter felt chosen, not staged. I won't lie, sometimes the old wound stings when I least expect it. A comment in passing, a look. But now I have a community who watches me and reminds me I matter. People asked why I had gone live instead of confronting the issue in private. My answer is simple. Sometimes people only hear the truth when it's in the light. That live wasn't revenge. It wasn't spectacle. It was an invitation to those who felt alone to show up in small ways that became enormous. The 50 people who showed weren't a mob. They were a neighborhood deciding that exclusion wasn't how we would behave. The loop closed that night in my yard, but it opened more doors. Neighbors started checking on each other. A local Facebook group formed to connect elders with people who could drive them to appointments. My story inspired others to tell theirs. I never wanted to be a symbol, but if my voice helped one person feel seen, I'll use it again. You ever wonder what happens when one person chooses to speak instead of shrink? I did. I went live because I was hurt, but I stayed because I found connection. If this touched you, share it with someone who needs to feel seen today. And don't forget to subscribe to Celeb Pulse for more true stories that remind us what family really is.